Okay, hi everybody. We're going to start now, and before I start, I'm going to give the same words of introduction I gave at the previous class, which is as follows. So halakha means Jewish law. Jewish law is not just about what we can't do, it's also about what we can do and how to live our lives. The word halakha comes from the Hebrew word lalechet, the verb which means to walk. So halakha is supposed to cover every aspect of our lives and imbue our lives with meaning. So tonight, the Teshuvah that I'm going to be discussing, that's Rabbi Joshua Heller's, it provides certain permissions for things that beforehand he considered and were normatively considered to be prohibited. And so there's very much a focus on this issue with live streaming about what we can't do. But last night at the ritual committee meeting, I presented a four-pronged plan for what we can and what we will do for the high holidays this year, given the extenuating circumstances. And I just wanted to share with you that I developed this plan after much anguish and sleepless nights and soul searching and analyzing, trying to deal with some of what I found to be some ethical dilemmas involved, wanting or striving to strike a balance between the needs of the community on the one hand and halachic integrity on the other hand. So although, as you know, many of you know, I worked in the business world before I became a rabbi, and I'm very familiar with marketing. I remember in business school learning the distinction between marketing and a sales approach. And when it comes to the business world, you absolutely have to put a marketing approach ahead of a sales approach, meaning you can't just take an existing product that you have and try to foist it on the masses. You are supposed to be seeing what the consumers want, and if need be, give them a different product than what you have on the shelf. And you can't do that when the product is Judaism, because you can't bend so much to consumer demand that the product becomes unrecognizable. So that's been my dilemma with all of this. But having said that, I do want to show you, share with you a sneak preview of the four-prong high holiday plan that it still needs to be fleshed out some more, but it's what I started discussing with the ritual committee last night. And at some point, hopefully in the near future, Nathan and I will talk about when we think a good forum for this would be. I'll present this to the rest of the congregation. But since you are on this class and on this call, I will share part of it with you now, just as I did with the previous class. So let me do that before we start the Teshuvah. Okay, and I'm going to share the screen for this. Okay, give me a thumbs up if you can see it on the screen. Okay, terrific. All right, so the basic part of this plan has these four components. One is providing some virtual experiences before the holidays and during the 10 days of Teshuvah between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Second piece are in-person experiences before the holidays and between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, those 10 days of Teshuvah. Prong 3 are in-person services on the holidays, and 4 virtual services on the holidays. And the last piece that I want to call your attention to, because that is the subject of today's call and class, I just want to make note and acknowledge that my position on this is that prong 4 is not permissible by Jewish law. And I do consider it to be what's an avera, which is the opposite of a mitzvah. But it's an avera l'shem shamayim. It's a transgression that I will permit for the sake of heaven, is literally what avera l'shem shamayim is. It's allowing for a violation of Jewish law for a limited time period for the sake of a higher good during what's known in the halachic literature as sha'at hadechak, the hour of pressing need. And I'm considering where we are right now, our situation. Right now, at the end of June, given the numbers in New Jersey of COVID incidents and daily new cases, I'm not considering it sha'at hadechak from a communal perspective, but I do understand that for many individuals that this is a sha'at hadechak for them. If we do, God forbid, reach a sha'at hadechak level of COVID, God forbid, 100 times, we will be offering streaming with Adi and I will be leading the services live, and then they will be live streamed. If we remain at a low prevalence level of COVID, or at least the level we're at now, there still will be streaming, but I won't be in front of the camera. I will be offering a live service, probably outdoors or in the social hall, while Adi is leading a service in the sanctuary, and that will be streamed regardless of the level of COVID. I'm not going to get into details now about what the level is, but there's I'll tell you, let me just get my chart out, but I'm not going to put it up because this class is shorter than the one that we had this afternoon, and I just don't have as much time to give details, but I can do this in a different forum. So just to give you an idea, yesterday, actually it was 2 days ago, the incidence of COVID in New Jersey was 1 out of 33,000. And so that's from the population in New Jersey, 1 new case per day out of 33,000 people. And when we were at our peak back in April, on April 5th specifically, the peak at that point, it was 1 out of 2,500 people. So out of every 2,500 people, one person tested positive for COVID or would have tested positive for COVID. What I'm considering to be Sha'at HaDachak is not that. We don't have to be all the way back at that high, crazy level, God forbid. But where we were at the end of May, when the governor first started issuing rulings and suggesting that there would be a phase 2 and possibly a phase 3, and he hadn't yet implemented, but had started making these announcements, then it was 1 in 10,000. And so if we get back to that level, which is higher than where we are now, then for the sake of this congregation and for the sake of this issue of whether or not we will stream and whether I will feel comfortable being in front of a camera, will be it'll be both of us, and that would be what is indicated here. As I said, Adi and I are still planning to do services together regardless. Let me just, actually, I don't think I said that. Let me show you that. Give me a moment. Okay, so I'm going to do another share screen and just share, I just fast forwarded to the end of this proposal. So if we do reach that Sha'at HaDachak threshold, the main service will be live streamed indoors, sanctuary, and I will be in it with the cancer. And we will offer a second shift service if it's permitted by New Jersey law outdoors, and we'll do that. We'll do 2 consecutive services. If the prevalence of new cases of COVID stays at where we are or gets lower, there still will be this middle part that's in green. There still is going to be a service that is live streamed. That's the one with Adi. But the main service, meaning probably the first service, the first shift, that will be outdoors or in the social hall. But Adi and I will do that together. And we'll try to maximize the number of people who are allowed by law with social distancing. And if need be, we'll add a second shift service that I will lead by myself outdoors or in the social hall. The second piece, as I said, it's not, when it's second shift, it doesn't mean it's less important. It's just that Adi and I can't be in 2 places at the same time. So one is going to be just an earlier shift and one's going to be a little bit later. So I did want to share that with you just because as I go about discussing Rabbi Heller's Teshuvah, and as we go about looking at what's involved in some of the issues and where I feel very torn and have felt very torn, you'll see where that's coming from. And it was very difficult for me to make the proposal that I did, but this is, I think, what needs to be done right now to satisfy as many people as possible without sacrificing my own halachic integrity. So now onto the Teshuvah, and one more preamble, which is not about the high holidays, but it's about the whole malacha system, the whole halachic system that is surrounding this issue. If you look in the chat, and I think you should all have it here, but I'll do it again just in case for people who came later. So I'd like you to open up the PDF of the 39 Melachot and then also the diagram. And I'm putting it back in the chat again if you didn't get it the first time. Okay, and I also have up there a link to Rabbi Danny Nevin's Teshuvah on electricity, because there's a lot of issues in there that pertain to this and that Rabbi Heller alludes to in his Teshuvah. Okay, so the first the diagram itself, the diagram is a picture of, or a diagram really, of the Mishkan. And the Mishkan, as you may know, was the temporary tabernacle that was used in biblical times before there was a temple. And all of the prohibitions of Shabbat, the categories of prohibited activity on Shabbat, they all derive from 39 categories of creative activity that were done to construct the Mishkan or to transport the Mishkan from one place to another. As you know, our ancestors were wandering Jews, and they would set up camp in one place, set up the Mishkan, and then they'd have to assemble the whole thing and then reset it up in their next place. And the reason why there is a conceptual link between the Mishkan and Shabbat is because, as Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel teaches, the Shabbat is to be viewed as a sanctuary in time that is parallel in a sense, or reflects in some way the sanctuary in space that was the Mishkan. So on Shabbat, what we are ideally striving to do is to create that moment, that time, that place, that situation where every moment feels imbued with holiness. And one of the ways to do that, one of the ways that Judaism has determined is a good way to do that, is to refrain from the kind of activities that are known in the Talmud as Melachot Machshevet, which are works in the sense of creative activity, but specifically those that were done with the Mishkan, so that every time we refrain from doing something on Shabbat, it's a reminder of, oh yeah, that's something that was used in the days of the Mishkan, and we're not going to do that now. So there's different levels of what is considered a prohibition. There's an Av Malacha, which is a main category, which is the most similar to what one of these 39 categories were in the Mishkan days. And then there's a Toledah, which is a subcategory of an Av Malacha. I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. And both of those are considered biblical prohibitions. And then below that, below, when I say below, it means in the days where there were punishments meted out for not observing Shabbat, which we don't have anymore. But when there was a higher level, a much worse punishment for violating a Torah prohibition than a rabbinic prohibition. So this third category, some people refer to it as Shevut, comes from the same word as Shabbat. And it's not so much about the 39 Melachot, it's more about the positive commandment to rest. And anything that takes you away from that positive commandment to rest on the Shabbat, that's what is considered, that's one of the types of activities that are considered Shevut, that we're supposed to stay away from on Shabbat. So let me now point you to the list of the 39 Melachot. Okay, so we looked at the diagram. If you could open up the list. Okay, the list, let me get my list. I got this from the 6th Street Community Synagogue. It has some typos in it, but I couldn't change them because it's not mine, and I thank Gabriel Z. Bellino, whoever he is, for putting this together. So these 39 categories, these are the names of the Melachot in English and in Hebrew. And just to mention some of them, to point out some of them that do come up in Rabbi Nevin's Teshuvah about electricity and in Rabbi Heller's Teshuvah about streaming specifically, are number 11, baking, cooking, bishul, or ofeh, sometimes it's called. The other malacha, these are the overall categories, the original categories, the Av Malachot. The number 32, which is writing, kotev. Number 34, boneh. Number 37, kindling, mavir. And number 38, makeh b'patish, final hammer blow. And that actually refers to any activity that serves to finish a product. So for example, if a string breaks on your guitar and you replace that string, that now makes the guitar complete again. That's considered a violation of makeh b'patish. It's one of the reasons why there is the prohibition against using musical instruments on Shabbat. There also, makeh b'patish, some view electricity in that vein, the completion of a circuit. Even though the electricity is already there, and even if you can say electricity is not fire, as many people do, well, certainly scientifically believe that, but halachically believe that as well, then still there could be a violation of Shabbat with the use of electricity, because you complete a circuit by turning on the switch. You break the circuit, the opposite of final hammer blow, by closing the circuit. So I just wanted you to see those to get some kind of idea. And If you want to open up Rabbi Nevin's Teshuvah, if you want to look at what I'm going to be reading now, in Rabbi Nevin's Teshuvah, he has a very nice definition of these different, not of the full 39, but of the distinction between an Av Malacha, a Toledah, and then what he calls Shevut. So I'm going to be going over those because they are referred to by Rabbi Heller in his streaming Teshuvah. So if you look on page 55, point 1, and I'm going to just read directly from this. The operation of electrical circuits is not inherently forbidden as either Melacha or Shevut. However, the use of electricity to power an appliance which performs Melacha with the same mechanism and intent as the original manual labor, meaning in the Mishkan, is biblically forbidden on Shabbat. For example, grinding coffee, trimming trees, sewing, etc. are all forbidden with electrical appliances in the same way as these activities are forbidden without the use of electricity, as that high category of biblical prohibition of Melacha. Point number 2. This is now going to be a definition of the Toledah. The plural of Toledah is Toledot, or Toldot. The use of electricity to perform an activity with a different mechanism, but for the same purpose as a Melacha, is forbidden to Jews on Shabbat as a derivative labor, Toledah. Such prohibitions share with the primary forms the severe status of being biblically forbidden, Isur d'Oraita, or Asur d'Oraita. Thus, cooking with an electrical heating element or microwave oven on Shabbat is forbidden as Toledat Bishul. Bishul is number 11, the cooking Melacha, though it is permitted on Yom Tov. Recording text, sound, images, or other data with an electronic device is forbidden as Toledat Kotev, a derivative form of writing. Sabbath and Yom Tov operation of any electronic recording device, camera, computer, tablet, or cellular phone is forbidden by this standard. Moreover, the creation of a durable image, as with a printer, is also forbidden as a derivative form of writing. Automation may be employed prior to Shabbat to set some such processes in motion, but even here one must be cautious about the temptation to make adjustments to such devices, as well as their capacity to undermine the distinct atmosphere of Shabbat. So those are the very good definitions, I think, by Rabbi Nevins of Av Malacha and Toledah. What is Shevut? So Shevut, that's that word that comes from Shabbat. It doesn't fit into the 39 Malacha system, but Danny Nevins, he defines it on page 39. And he says that Shevut is, I'm going to read it in the bottom part of the page. It's the third to last paragraph. Instead of prohibiting the Israelite from working on Shabbat, it gives a positive commandment to rest. The Torah is interested not only in creating an internal state of tranquility, but also in fostering a public atmosphere of rest, which includes not only the free Israelite, but also everybody in his household. And if you look at the next paragraph, it says medieval lists of the 613 mitzvot, that includes Maimonides, mention resting, Shevut, as one of the 248 positive commandments, though the status of the Shevut restrictions is considered to be rabbinic, so d'Rabbanan instead of d'Oraita. Just a couple of other snippets to kind of give you an idea of what Shevut is. And Rabbi Nevins writes this in other parts of his Teshuvah. On page 41, page 43, he talks about Shabbat being a day of delight, a day where we should focus our minds on divine creation, a day where we should express appreciation for life and liberty, and to be especially attuned to spiritual partnership with God. It's a day to focus on spiritual creativity instead of physical creativity, and it's all in order to preserve the tranquil, sacred nature of the day. So with all of that in mind, now we can go ahead and look at Rabbi Heller's Teshuvah. So if you want to open up Rabbi Heller's Teshuvah, let me find my copy of Rabbi Heller's Teshuvah. Yeah, here we go. And let's start at the beginning. We're not going to do every single page, but we'll do a good amount in here just so we can get a sense of what Rabbi Heller's arguments are and what permissions he allows and by what criteria he allows those permissions. So first, just to show you on page 1 in terms of halachic process, if you look at the very bottom of the page, underneath the line that's for footnotes, it reads, the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards of the Rabbinical Assembly provides guidance in matters of halakha for the conservative movement. The individual rabbi, however, is the authority for the interpretation and application of all matters of halacha. So the law committee, which is another way of referring to the CJLS, consists of 25 people who are halachicists. They are experts in halacha. Many of them do have pulpits, but many of them do not. And what they all have in common is that they have committed time and they have the expertise to be able to write teshuvot, such as the one you have here by Rabbi Heller. The word teshuvah means response, or responsum is how it's sometimes referred to in this context. If you ask me a question just about anything, like what color is an apple, or better yet, what color is a strawberry? This is a clear-cut answer for that. She'elah is the question, teshuvah is the answer. When it comes to these kind of questions that are being addressed by the law committee, the questions are much broader and the answers are generally very complicated and involve a lot of references to places in the Talmud and in the medieval codes and modern codes and contemporary codes. And this teshuvah by Rabbi Heller fits into that mold. And the way it works is when a question is brought before the law committee, there's a subcommittee that is assigned, and then someone on the subcommittee or a few of the people on that subcommittee spend many months, sometimes years, doing research and writing a teshuvah with all the appropriate footnotes, and there's a whole editorial process back and forth as if they were submitting a journal article, but it's taken to that same level of seriousness. And then there's a vote. And if you look at the top of page 1, you'll see that this teshuvah by Rabbi Heller was approved on May 13th, 2020 by a vote of 19 in favor, 3 opposed, 3 abstaining. And then there's a list of the rabbis who fit into each of those camps, which is very helpful for rabbis like me, Mara Da'atra of any individual community, because the way we make our individual decisions is by reading teshuvot, but also talking to some of the people who have voted for and against it to get a sense of why they voted, they did the way they did, what would have made them vote in favor of it if they voted against it, what would have made them vote against it if they did vote in favor of it, any issues around it. No rabbi in the world that I know has time to call every single rabbi who's voted on every single teshuvah. I've spoken to a handful of these rabbis, that's 7 of them. And so I just wanted to point that out. And if you look at one more thing on page 1 before I ask you to turn to page 2, it says here in the introduction, you might have thought that this question came up just when COVID hit, but it didn't. So before he introduces the question, Rabbi Heller writes that the teshuvah was in its early stages before the COVID-19 crisis, as some conservative synagogues had already instituted electronic access to their services, and others were considering this innovation. The question took on a dramatic new urgency as almost every synagogue in the world was forced to suspend in-person physical worship, etc. So Rabbi Heller's writing this teshuvah was an attempt to legislate what people were already doing. In this way, it's very similar to the driving teshuvah. The driving teshuvah did not have this same halachic process with a bunch of 25 rabbis. By the way, in order for a teshuvah to be passed, it could be considered a legitimate position in the movement. It needs 6 votes. It doesn't need to have a supermajority or anything like that, except for certain cases, certain types of Jewish laws, but this one would fit into the category of 6 alone is enough, and this vote was approved by an overwhelming majority, 19, obviously more than 6. But the driving teshuvah was also an attempt to legislate something that people were already doing. In the days when the driving teshuvah came to be, that's when synagogues in the city were closing and many of them moving to the suburbs, where suburban shuls were moving to areas that made it was much further from where people lived. Oftentimes people then would move into neighborhoods and there wouldn't be a shul within walking distance. So the only way to get to shul would be to drive, and a lot of people were doing this. And this original teshuvah on driving was an attempt to legislate that. And I think in a way, this is what Rabbi Heller was trying to do. I think the number he said was between 10 and 20% of conservative shuls were already live streaming before this teshuvah gave the permission. So if you look now on page 2, this actually is the she'elah and the teshuvah. So you might have heard the word shaila, which is just how they pronounce she'elah in Borough Park in Lakewood, but it's the same question. She'elah is the question. Is it permitted for a synagogue or other prayer community to offer a stream of its services on Shabbat or Yom Tov If so, what are the concerns that must be addressed when this is done? Are the parameters for the current crisis, meaning COVID, different than they might be in more usual times? And then the Teshuvah is the next, however many pages this is, 30 plus pages. And he begins by acknowledging that many congregations were already offering streaming services. And then the second paragraph, I'm going to read this out loud only because I want you to get a little bit into Rabbi Heller's brain, that this was a very hard teshuvah for him to write. And he acknowledges what is out there and also the diversity within the conservative movement. He writes, some congregations appropriately concerned about possible violations of Shabbat and Yom Tov have offered services through electronic means only for weekday services, Kabbalat Shabbat or Havdalah. That's what we've been doing. They may find the pressure harder to resist in the longer term, particularly for high holidays 57, 81. There will also be significant pressure to continue some type of streaming option even after the current crisis. So he acknowledges this, and actually David Shuck, Rabbi Shuck, in his Teshuvah, he is very critical of this, how do I say, he can't be critical of how somebody feels, but he's critical of the fact that it seems like Rabbi Heller gave up, that, here it's like, this is the way it's going to be, and everyone's doing this, and everyone's going to have pressure. And he writes in his Teshuvah that he feels for those rabbis. He's one of those rabbis, okay? So he writes on page 9 of his Teshuvah, Rabbi Shuck, he says, the rabbis in our movement who have tried to lead their communities through this pandemic without utilizing virtual platforms on Shabbat, in particular multi-way video conferencing software like Zoom, are now under tremendous pressure to do so. The market forces will prioritize competitive offerings over the principles and values that have always shaped our communities. And our colleagues are unlikely to be able to withstand this pressure for too long. I want to express my support for my colleagues who have felt isolated in their leadership by the conservative movement's embrace of this responsum. I also want to suggest that when the leaders of our movement speak about this change, they take special care to also lend their support of and appreciation for the rabbis whose vision does not align with this shift. So that's Rabbi Shuck commenting on Rabbi Heller. Let's go back to Rabbi Heller now. If you look on page 2, there's a nice outline there of how the Teshuvah is organized. We're not going to go through all the parts, but just so that you see, we already read part of, we're right on top of number 1, why this Teshuvah is necessary. Then there is 2, a review of issues related to streaming on weekdays, specifically dealing with issues like reliance on non-Jews to manage the equipment and fulfilling one's obligations through a video connection. Number 3, which is a big chunk of this paper, of this Teshuvah, potential violations of Shabbat and Yom Tov involved in streaming and their mitigation. And you can see the rest in larger communal implications. If you want just the short version, Reader's Digest, if you go all the way to the end to section 8, conclusions and psak, and I'd say not all the way to the end because the last 2 pages are very hard to understand unless you're a computer scientist or engineer or programmer. But pages 28 and 29 are the bottom line for Rabbi Heller. And I will go to that at some point, but I do want to flesh out a little bit more of what's in the body of the Teshuvah. Okay, so if you look on page 3, again, Rabbi Heller is admitting the same kind of admission he makes on page 1. He says, it must also be pointed out that there are 6 other days of the week on which there are much lower halachic barriers to using technology. Why not focus our energies on those days and preserve the sanctity of Shabbat and Yom Tov as screen-free times? There is certainly an argument to be made in this direction, and some communities may choose to offer Kabbalat Shabbat and Havdalah and leave Shabbat intact. And then he goes on to say why he's not in that group. So if you turn now to page 7, I think it is, yes, page 7. So beginning on page 7, this is section 2 of the Teshuvah. These are issues, halachic issues, already addressed by the CJLS, by the Law Committee. And what Rabbi Heller does is summarize them so that you don't have to go back to the originals, although I do think it's very helpful to go back to at least the electricity ones. I hope that's one you'll save in your files and look up when you have more time. But one of the main, I guess not main, one of the pillars upon which Rabbi Heller's Teshuvah is standing is this question of may one fulfill one's obligation to pray by hearing or responding to prayers transmitted electronically. And he's relying on a Teshuvah by Rabbi Reisner, Avram Reisner. It's the same Rabbi Reisner who wrote a dissent to this Teshuvah, but Rabbi Reisner also had a Teshuvah where he spoke about, I think it's called Wired to the Kadosh Baruch Hu, and it permits, if you look at that first line, Rabbi Avram Reisner established that it is permitted to participate in services via a real-time audio connection. He wrote that in 2001. And then if you skip to the middle of the page, he does say, but one important limitation of Reisner's approach is that a minyan of at least 10 must be constituted in person, and then others may participate remotely. So that's something that I and many other conservative rabbis were relying upon when we're on vacation or somewhere where we can't make it to shul, and we need to be able to say Kaddish or want to participate in a minyan for other reasons, that we could participate remotely, but there need to be 10 live people in a room somewhere in one place in order to participate. When COVID started to spread closer to home in March, the law committee didn't have time to issue Teshuvah. This Teshuvah wasn't out yet. They were still trying to finalize it. But as Rabbi Heller writes in his Teshuvah, a few members of the CJLS have offered temporary guidance that allows for more lenient approaches during a time of global pandemic, when gathering 10 people together in one place is unsafe and or illegal in many communities. This Hora'at Sha'ah means a ruling for the hour, a temporary ruling, which was not accepted by the majority of the law committee, suggests the possibility of constituting a minyan via a multi-way visual and audio connection so that at least 10 participants can see and hear the And that's the leniency upon which we've been relying for our weekday minyans. There are some rabbis who are considering it a full-fledged minyan, others who are not considering it a minyan at all, more just like a gathering at which we say some prayers together. And there's some various rabbis in the middle. I'm one of those rabbis in the middle on this issue. So, for example, there are some rabbis who will not do any what's called Devarim Shabikdusha, words of holiness. So there are certain words of holiness in our prayers that require 10 people in order to say them, like the Baruch Hu, like Torah reading from a scroll, like the Kedusha and the Amidah, etc. And of course the Kaddish, all those Kaddishes. And so there's some rabbis who won't allow any of them, and they're doing Zoom minyans, but doing everything out loud that doesn't include anything that you would otherwise need 10 for. There are other rabbis at the other end of the spectrum who are allowing all of those Devarim Shabikdusha, some of them only for this period of Sha'at HaZafak, and some of them perhaps intending to do this for the long term. I don't know. We'll see what happens. Those of us in the middle, there is a position that treats mourner's Kaddish and Kaddish D'Rabbanan separately, because in the halachic literature from the Gaonic period, even before we had Maimonides and the other medieval poskim, back then, Kaddish was something that was considered separate than other Devarim Shabikdusha. So the Amidah, all the other Baruch Hu, those were all in existence prior. Mourner's Kaddish didn't even exist until much later, so it was treated separately. And not only was it a later development, but it also is something that has very special resonance to people, particularly during the year of mourning for a parent, on yurt sites. And so there was a little bit more room for leniency, at least during Sha'at HaZafak. So I had reached out to Rabbi Reisner almost immediately when I first heard about COVID, to see what the situation would be and to see rewriting his Teshuvah. He didn't rewrite the Teshuvah, but he did issue this temporary guidance, as did the RA. So the streaming Teshuvah does depend a bit on that. If you look now on page 8, another previous Teshuvah, this one's not from 2001, this is from 1989. It's Rabbi Gordon Tucker wrote a Teshuvah on video audio feeds on Shabbat and Yom Tov. So this is coming a lot closer to what we're talking about here. And so I'll read the first paragraph on page 8. In 1989, the CJLS overwhelmingly approved a Teshuvah by Rabbi Gordon Tucker, which concluded that it was permissible to offer a video audio feed of a Shabbat or Yom Tov service in another room in a particular facility, or indeed in a different facility, with the following caveats. Now, many people looked at this Teshuvah and didn't read past the word caveats. This often happens, like what happened with the driving Teshuvah. Everyone thinks conservative movement allows driving on Shabbat. It really doesn't. It says it's okay to do this violation of Jewish law if there's no other way for someone to be able to get to shul. They live too far or they're too sick to get there in any other way. But here there are caveats as well. And the caveats that Rabbi Tucker included are, it should be permitted provided that, 1, No permanent tape is made in the process. 2, the equipment is set up before Shabbat or Yontiv and either turned on or placed on a timer. 3, the equipment is either inaccessible to adjustment or repair, or is placed in the skilled hands of a non-Jew in the employ of the synagogue. And 4, there is no noticeable distortion in the visual or sound components of the system. You have to read the Teshuvah to get an explanation of all those caveats, but Rabbi Heller does rely on those. Okay, now I want you to move ahead to page 11. There's a whole section here on potential violations of Shabbat and streaming on Shabbat, potential violations of Shabbat when we do stream on Shabbat and how to mitigate them. To his credit, and he is really an amazing halachicist in this way, he tries really hard to provide ways to prevent Shabbat violations in the use of streams. And he realizes that he has to do many backbends in order to do this. Some of his safeguards are not particularly realistic. They may be realistic for people who are very tech savvy. He's someone who knows this stuff a lot better than I do, or probably than any of us on this call. Josh, before he was a rabbi, he had a computer science degree from Harvard. So he's a tech expert. Let's leave it at that, as opposed to, in addition to being a halachic expert. So he writes, though, here in this second paragraph, he says, in order, this is the second sentence, he's referring to Rabbi Danny Nevin's Teshuvah on electricity. And he says, in order to be forbidden on Shabbat, an activity must be forbidden either at a biblical level, because it falls into one of the 39 categories that I mentioned earlier, or at a rabbinic level, because it is similar to one of these labors. Okay. And then he lists some of the different melachot that I mentioned before and that are on that list. And his last sentence in this paragraph, Nevins reviews these claims and argues, following the lead of Arthur Newlander's 1950 CJLS responsum, that electricity in and of itself is not forbidden on Shabbat, but entails a violation when it is used for a forbidden purpose, like cooking. So, yes, there are conservative rabbis like myself who don't use electricity at all. There are others who use it for everything. But the Rabbi Nevin's position in this Teshuvah, and that Rabbi Heller relies upon, is that some electricity is permitted, some is not. If you have electricity that is serving a function that is the end result, the end product is something that you're not supposed to be producing on Shabbat, then it would be prohibited. Otherwise, it would be permitted. In the Talmud, the word that's used for permitted is patur, which means really exempt. But patur doesn't mean completely allowed. It means patur aval asur, which means in English, exempt, but it's still not permitted, meaning you're exempt from the punishment that you would get for violating a biblical prohibition, but it's still not allowed, according to the rabbis. The reason why Rabbi Heller and Rabbi Nevins, to some extent, is okay with some of these rabbinic prohibitions is because their sense is that they're, I wouldn't say less important, they don't use that terminology, but that they would have carried lesser penalties, so therefore we could be more lenient in interpreting them. And Rabbi Nevins is a lot more restrictive in his use of electricity than Rabbi Heller is. So Rabbi Nevins, for example, let me see if I can find the page here. Yes. Rabbi Nevins does not allow for, on page 35 of Rabbi Nevins' Teshuvah, the use of electrical and electronic devices on Shabbat. Page 35. The intentional recording of data, whether of text, images, or sounds, is forbidden on Shabbat as a derivative form of writing. While this form of recording may not employ the same mechanism as the writing used in the tabernacle, whatever that was, it has the same purpose and result, to preserve information for later display. And then later on in the paragraph, Rabbi Nevins writes that this form of writing should be considered a derivative form of the prohibition, Toledah kotev, which is biblically prohibited on Shabbat and Yontiv. Thus, we would prohibit the Sabbath operation of a digital camera, voice recorder, or computer used for writing text or recording audio or video files. These activities are all derivative forms of writing and are therefore biblically forbidden on Shabbat and Yom Tov. So clearly that addresses the recording issue. A live stream, is that considered a recording or not? A live stream, yes, you can record it, but do you have to? You noticed in the Rabbi Gordon Tucker Teshuvah, he says you're allowed to have a fixed camera somewhere as long as there's no recording. Rabbi Levin, who is one of the authors of, she's one of the ones who voted against the Teshuvah on the law committee, and she wrote the dissent. She writes, about Kotev on here on page 3 of her Teshuvah. She quotes Rabbi Nevin's, the part I just read, and then she said, in addition, there's the digital and unintentional writing that takes place every time we use a computer, tablet, or cell phone, recording when we open and close every program or app at the very least. So even when we don't want to make a permanent record, even when we don't press the record button, there still is this constant digitizing of information, connections, Wi-Fi connections. There are records that exist. For those of you who've ever had a computer crash, oftentimes that doesn't end with a happy note, but sometimes it does, and you're able to retrieve the data because it's somewhere, it's hidden somewhere, it's that you can find on some old hard drive or hopefully in the cloud. As you know, although it may look like it's very easy to erase written materials on the computer, it's actually, there's a lot more record keeping than you think. And it's been explained to me by engineers. I don't know if I could explain it back to you in engineering language, but there are others on this call who probably could address that issue. So I wanted you to see that about Kotev and what Rabbi Levin says about it. I then want you to look now at page 17. Some of the things that Rabbi Heller does, and again, he tries really hard to create these safeguards to prevent or minimize or mitigate the violation of Shabbat when using these electronic technologies. Page 17, the third paragraph, the one that starts with the words no matter. No matter what arguments are made regarding muktzah or kila achar yad, those are two, so muktzah are things that you can't move. Some people say you can't touch on Shabbat because they are associated with prohibitive activities. Kila achar yad means doing something, it means with the other hand. So if like you normally write with your right hand, that if you this time write with your left hand, unless you're ambidextrous, like that would perhaps some would consider that's not as bad of a violation of the Melachot of Kotev because it's kila achar yad. Rabbi Heller tries to make the arguments in an earlier page that of this Teshuvah that kila achar yad is one way you can view the computer, that it's not the regular way of writing. Regular way of writing is with a pen, and this is not. Others argue the opposite, saying it's actually the most typical form of writing. When was the last time you wrote a postcard or a letter, right? More, especially people in the younger generations, I don't think they even know where to buy a stamp. So anyway, what does Rabbi Heller write? He says here, no matter what arguments are made, once one is interacting with electronic devices, new temptations are created. Some adjustments like pausing, adjusting the volume, or muting might fall into the category of Shevut. Shevut is that third category, the rabbinic prohibitions that go beyond the 39 categories of Melachot. Others, configuring a device, typing in a password, might be forbidden at a more serious level. Any computer, phone, or tablet generates alerts and potential distractions. I recognize that this suggestion might not be widely adopted, but it would be preferable for users to do something that makes it clear that they are using their device in an unusual way and discourages them from interacting with it. For example, on a computer, covering the keyboard or unplugging an external mouse or any device, or setting a do not disturb or parental controls. Furthermore, the act of designating the use of the device before Shabbat should be done in some explicit way. And he goes on with other safeguards, acknowledging that it's not very realistic, but I, Rabbi Heller, I'm doing my part to do what I can to limit violations here. Okay, the next part I wanted you to look at is, why don't we just go right ahead to the Psak, because I'm looking at the time and we just may not have time to do as much as I did on the earlier class. Okay, Rabbi Heller's Psak on page 28. He starts out by acknowledging that this is an unprecedented time in our Jewish tradition. He provides more safeguards here, set up so that it's running before the holiday. He talks about the use of a non-Jewish employee. He's told me many times that has happened where on Shabbat morning when they've done streaming, he gets to shul and it's not working, and his quote-unquote Shabbos goy, which I don't love that term, will take care of it for him. Like magically everything will fix. There are some synagogues, not only Reform synagogues, now there are conservative ones as well, that have sound engineers on staff and who fiddle around with the equipment during the service itself to make sure, or to try to ensure that there aren't glitches. And he goes on with some of his safeguards. He then goes on, Rabbi Heller, on page 29 to say, we must educate our communities as to the meaning of Shabbat observance and offer guidance how to participate in ways that do not violate Shabbat. Still, we must be realistic that these video links will also be accessed by those who choose to do so in a way that is not respectful of the letter or spirit of Hilchot Shabbat, the laws of the Sabbath. This fact does not prohibit offering the stream, but does mandate that synagogues that offer a stream do so in a way that minimizes the types of violations. He's said this in many different ways over the Teshuvah, so I may sound like I'm repeating myself because he repeats himself as well. If you look in the appendix on pages 33 and 34, there's a very detailed list of how to try to make your technology more Shabbat friendly, whether it's turning off the screensaver, all different kind of things. I couldn't make heads or tails of most of this, but if you are more tech savvy than I am, I'm sure you can. But Rabbi Heller himself recognizes that it's not going to be so easy to avoid some of these violations. Rabbi Reisner, in his dissent to Rabbi Heller's Teshuvah, specifically addresses that last part, the last part that Rabbi Heller wrote with the psak. And Rabbi Reisner is a man of few words, and he has only a 2-page dissent. And he writes on page 2, it's the second paragraph, he says, this type of nuanced, situation-specific guidance, like the kind Rabbi Heller provides, like including what's in the appendix, is thoroughly appropriate between rabbi and congregant in personal congregation that can start with education about full Shabbat observance and evolve to address the specific readiness of the congregant for some level of respect for its spirit. It is misplaced in a formal Teshuvah for the conservative movement. That is in part why we have always insisted on the primary role of the Marid Atra, the local rabbinic authority. I began, he said, with an epigraph set in an altogether other context that I posted on the wall beside my desk a dozen years ago, the first of what has become a gallery of wisdom to live by, Kivyachol, my personal Pirkei Avot. It says succinctly what motivates my dissent. The policy so carefully set out in this Teshuvah, Rabbi Heller's Teshuvah, falls into a trap that we have fallen into before. It makes that which we do not feel is the right thing to do, that which is probably going to happen anyway. So it's kind of assuming as a foregone conclusion that this is happening anyway. So kind of throw up your hands in defeat. It legislates the realistic over the ideal. It is, in my view, and he says, he has a phrase there where he says he thinks it's wrong. Okay, so Rabbi Reisner's dissent is very much about legislating the real over the ideal. Rabbi Shuck, his main, he doesn't have one, but I'd say a very big piece of Rabbi Shuck, his dissent to Rabbi Heller, is that he takes some of his halacha categories too far, including his definition of sha'at hadechak, the idea of this being a pressing, extenuating circumstance. Yes, it is in many ways, and certainly in March and April it was, and through May, who knows, September, but things are looking good based on the graphs, or at least they're looking better in New Jersey. But Rabbi Shuck thinks that there should have been some kind of expiration date on this Teshuvah, as do I. I'm much more comfortable with the idea of we're allowing this, even though it's a violation of Jewish law, but we're allowing it for this temporary period of time because of these extenuating circumstances. The other piece that Rabbi Shuck, his concern about Rabbi Heller's Teshuvah, and Rabbi Levin mentions this as well, is the idea of pikuach nefesh. A lot of people have mentioned this to me in private conversations and questions that they've asked me along the way. Yes, it is true that Shabbat, any Shabbat restriction, any Shabbat prohibition can be overridden for the sake of pikuach nefesh. That is absolutely true when there is an immediate need, when somebody is sick and there's a danger of something happening to them, God forbid, that is life-threatening or close to potentially life-threatening. You do whatever it takes to violate Shabbat. Even in the most observant of communities, if a woman goes into labor, even though childbirth is not as risky as it was in the Middle Ages, it's still a life-threatening proposition. And if you were going to walk to the hospital being pregnant, that might not be the wisest thing and could potentially risk the life of the mother, not to mention the fetus. And so you're allowed to break Shabbos to do that, but there's never the thought that, oh, now Shabbos rules have changed. Shabbos rules have not changed. They've changed only insofar as the violation is allowed for this particular circumstance. So Rabbi Shuck writes that that's how this Teshuvah should have been written. It's for this circumstance, and then don't give up and say, Rabbi Heller, that it's a foregone conclusion. Everyone's going to do this anyway, so we may as well allow it, which is kind of how it comes across in some ways, even if Rabbi Heller didn't intend it to be that way. And then with the Pikuach Nefesh piece, where Rabbi Shuck points to, let me be more specific, let me get the page, it's page 6. Page 6 of Rabbi Shuck's Teshuvah, he says, Rabbi Heller makes two claims about Pikuach Nefesh, the saving of a life. The first is that in-person services could actually unwittingly spread disease and take many lives. He's correct about this. But why does this mean that it is permissible to violate rabbinic and maybe Torahitic prohibitions by Zooming services on Shabbat? Again, a synagogue could simply focus its Shabbat prayer experience on Friday night to maintain communal bonds. Since when is one permitted to violate Shabbat in order to pray with one's community when one prayed with them the night before? This brings me to Rabbi Heller's second claim about Pikuach Nefesh, which is that the loneliness of sheltering at home itself poses a danger to the lives of those who are isolated. If a community is engaging its membership all week, it is difficult to make this claim. So that's how Rabbi Shuck dissents with Rabbi Heller on this point of Pikuach Nefesh. Rabbi Levin takes a slightly different tack, and she writes, this is on page 1, the bottom of her Teshuvah. It's not a Teshuvah, it's a dissent. She says, once the premise is in question that we are intractably in a she'at hadechak, extenuating moment, the complex methods Rabbi Heller devises for streaming, zooming, recording, logging on and off virtual services lose their most compelling element. Our lives are not at risk. Indeed, the welfare of our congregations are not at risk if we relate to this COVID-19 period as perplexing, challenging, but something less than she'at hadechak. That is not to say that physical distancing, hand washing, masks, and gloves are not necessary. They are. And their efficacy in containing the spread of the virus has been proven repeatedly in parts of the world where they have been most strictly imposed. Now, moving ahead to the page 2, the bottom of the page, she says, if the streaming recording is of a service that is indeed being held within the synagogue building with members of the congregation sitting at appropriate distances from one another and wearing masks, etc., there remains the issue of streaming or recording someone who does not wish to appear before a camera during these sacred times. As Rabbi Heller acknowledges, one can easily be recorded walking to shul on a public street or entering a synagogue. But the cameras recording these actions are in place on the principle of Pikuach Nefesh, saving a life, which does not apply to live streaming or recording services. Indeed, even synagogues that do monitor their entrances with cameras for security purposes would not or should not have cameras in their sanctuaries for the same purpose. I agree that the synagogue is a public space, but the sanctuary is meant to be a sanctuary from the vast public spaces that are not subject to halachic standards. And elsewhere, I can't remember whether it was in Rabbi Shuck's or Rabbi Heller's, the acknowledgement that there is a distinction between an imminent Pikuach Nefesh situation and a situation that potentially could put you at risk if you don't follow the correct safety guidelines. So the very last thing that I wanted to do is, well, I guess it's two last things. I don't know if I'll have time to do both, is Rabbi Malik in Highland Park Conservative Temple, and I know their synagogue population is way different than ours, but he has a proposal that he presented that is being implemented for the high holidays for this year. And one of the premises of his proposal is based on, let me see if I could put the link up here. No, I put Nevin's up again. Okay, I'll share the screen because I can't find the link. I thought I had it up there. So Rabbi Malik, he has a list here of 10 reasons for not streaming on Shabbat and Yom Tov. Let's see if I could stretch this out a bit, make it bigger. Okay, give me a thumbs up if you see it. I'm only seeing like 6 faces on the screen. Okay, good. Okay, so he has 10. And only number 1 is a halachic objection. He has 9 other reasons for not streaming on Shabbat and Yom Tov, which are very interesting. 2, Shabbat and Yom Tov are holy. We're tied to our devices all week. Holy days enable us to declare our freedom from them and not have them enslave us. Holy days require holy behavior. Going offline enables holiness. Be holy is one of our key themes. Number 3, focus. Streaming takes your focus off the real purpose of being there, which is the service. On Zoom, the focus is always on the other people who are present. 4, muting and blocking. When streaming on Zoom, you have to mute or block, I think what he wants to say is that which defeats the purpose of coming together. On Zoom, you hear everything and see everything. That's when everyone's unmuted. Sometimes you don't want to see everything or hear everything. Barbara's laughing because she's on Minion every night and knows what that means. Okay, number 5, our brand as a traditional shul. Not streaming differentiates our shul and maintains our traditionalist posture. 6, quality and malfunction. Unless you use professional service and equipment, engineers and technicians, which is really expensive, it will always be flawed and there is always the potential of malfunction. 7, endurance. Anything beyond 30 minutes pushes the limits of people's endurance and attention spans. 8, passivity. Streaming reinforces passivity in congregants and caters to the lowest common denominator in shul life. Streaming services enables people to engage in other behavior while online. Invariably, people will succumb to boredom and not be able to resist their online habits. 9, accept the loss. The pandemic has created a unique moment. Part of the uniqueness of this moment is the experience of loss. We are deeply saddened that we can't see each other in person and be normal. The detachment from our shul is a loss. We will do better in the long run by accepting the depth of this loss and disruption, rather than present the illusion that we can be at shul without being there. And then 10, finally, Rabbi Malik writes, focusing on something other than God. Streaming concentrates on viewership and not worship. It's more about the production, personalities, and number of viewers than it is about the content, which in prayer is the divine human relationship. That is very troubling. That is very deeply troubling. At its worst, streaming becomes a way to gratify rabbinic narcissism. I didn't know that was a thing, but I guess it is. Okay, so I'm now going to open up for questions. We have, I think, about 15 minutes before Minyan, but I'll continue Q&A afterwards if you so want. If you don't feel comfortable asking your question and you want to pose it in the chat privately to me, you can do that. Some people did submit questions to me in advance that I already answered. Those people were on a previous call. I'm happy to share those questions and the answers to them if you want. But why don't we start with your questions if you have any, and you have the ability to unmute yourself, or you can raise your hand and I'll unmute you, either way. No questions, awesome. Leroy, you're smiling. I don't know if that means I have nothing to say. I've asked all my questions. I'm done with my questions. Let me, while you're thinking of a question, if you have one, or 2 or 3 or 10, I wanted to read to you Rabbi Abraham Heschel, since I started with a quote from, or the concept of Rabbi Heschel of Shabbat being a sanctuary in time that reflects the sanctuary in space that was the Mishkan. There is a quote by Rabbi Heschel that is in Rabbi Nevin's Teshuvah on electricity. It's on page 53, and he writes, to set apart one day a week for freedom, a day on which we would not use the instruments which have been so easily turned into weapons of destruction, a day for being with ourselves, a day of detachment from the vulgar, of independence, of external obligations, a day on which we stop worshiping the idols of technical civilization, a day on which we use no money. Is there any institution that holds out a greater hope for man's progress than the Sabbath? And I think Rabbi Heschel's point is well taken, that Shabbat in its ideal, even if you don't call yourself or consider yourself to be Shomer Shabbos, there still is a tremendous opportunity for every Jewish person to break away from technology on Shabbat, even if not following the exact letter of the law, doing it in a way that really is freeing, that is liberating, especially now in the days of COVID, where we've spent so much time on technology. I think I've been in front of a screen for 7 or 8 hours today already. My eyes are bleary. I can't even see faces anymore. I have to really focus to even read your names at this point, which is horrible. At 8 o'clock in the morning, I was a little bit more alert. I was still sleeping, but alert because I hadn't been in front of the screen all day. Even those who are not in front of screens, think about how much technology you use and what a gift it is that you can give yourself to abstain from technology for one day. And I thank God every day for that ability to do that every Shabbat. And we need to find ways to do that while, of course, taking into account particular circumstances and extenuating situations like the one we're in right now. So I will leave it at that. I see, Elaine, you're back with us. Is that for Minyan or to hear the end of this, this session? Elaine, did you have another question? No? Okay. All right, Rick. And you can make a comment if you don't have a question also. Okay, Rick, you're on.
Okay, nobody's raising their hands, but there were two questions that came up in the earlier program that I like the answer. I thought it would be good to share the answers with this group. Before I mention them, I will say I want to thank you, Rabbi, for this presentation. I found both of them today to be very educational. The question, I think it was Carol's, I can't remember. One was about streaming on regular Shabbats, even, and the other was about streaming on the Shabbat of day one Rosh Hashanah, which is Shabbat. I just thought it would be interesting for the people to hear the answers to those.
Okay, so there are distinctions between Shabbat and holidays in general when it comes to the use of electricity. I don't use any electricity on Shabbat. There are some electrical things I will use if I have forgotten to set them in place in motion before Yontiv. Rabbi Nevin's is very permissive on Yontiv. Just to give you an idea, in Rabbi Nevin's Teshuvah on page 57, he has a nice little chart. So if you don't want to read all 60 pages of that Teshuvah, that's a good one pager. And he has a category for Shabbat and a category for Yontiv. And yes, there's a lot more permissiveness because you're allowed to cook on holiday. Two, you're allowed to carry on holiday, so it frees up a lot of things. There's a general category that's not a malacha category, but it's called ochel nefesh. Anything that any malacha that somehow is connected to preparing a meal or food. Most of them, I should say not any, are permitted on Yontiv. So this year, Rosh Hashanah, one day is on Shabbat, one day is on a weekday, Saturday. Well, we don't consider Sunday a weekday, but from a halachic perspective, it's a weekday. When it comes to the streaming issue, I don't think there's any difference between them. Rabbi Nevins, the author of the Electricity Teshuvah, he says that the use of a computer or any kind of recording device, no matter which way it's recording, is asur. It's forbidden, both on Shabbat and on Yom Tov. I'm allowing the live stream not because I think it's permissible on Yom Tov, but because of this extenuating circumstance. Going back to the proposal for high holidays that I had put up earlier, one of the prongs, the fourth prong, I'll put it back on the screen so you can see it. So before I actually outline what it is that we're hoping to do, note, must acknowledge that this is not permissible by Jewish law. It would be considered an aveira l'shem shamayim, a violation of Jewish law for the sake of heaven, a greater good, for a limited time period with an expiration date. So that's my approach to this whole thing. I'm not making a distinction between Shabbat and Yom Tov because I don't think it's allowed on a weekday Yom Tov any more than it is on Shabbat, but I will be allowing it because I'm allowing this violation of Jewish law because of our extenuating circumstance and considering that our congregation, there are many individuals in our congregation who, while it may not be Sha'at HaDachak for the community at large come September, for individuals with underlying health conditions, elderly, sick, whatever, immunocompromised, for them as individuals, it is a Sha'at HaDachak. So that's why I'm willing to, in this circumstance, allow it. Thanks, Rick. The other question that was asked, I don't know, some of you may remember Bruce Kesselman. Bruce Kesselman joined us from Las Vegas he did say that you can fly to Las Vegas now for, I think, $50. I think he said 49, probably before tax. I don't know who's going there. I think the casinos are even open. But in any event, his question, I have it here because he sent it to me in advance. Now it just means, how do I find it? Here it is. Okay, Bruce Kesselman asked, can a service be recorded on Shabbat if a camera is set to go on at a specific time but programmed in advance so that the service can be watched after Shabbat is over? And I think I already addressed this question, but recording is a violation for sure. That is definitely in violation of Malacha number 32, which is kotev, writing. writing does not mean only literally writing. It's creating meaningful symbols and ways that communicate and that endure in some way. And so Rabbi Heller actually says no to recording, even though he's very permissive on many fronts. Rabbi Heller does not allow recording. Rabbi Tucker, Rabbi Gordon Tucker, who's the one who wrote the Teshuvah back in '89 about the recording devices, he also forbids that. And I'm going to show you something else.
Hey, Rabbi, a quick question on that.
Yeah.
So when we talk about writing, is that a prohibition for Jews or for everybody? Because quite honestly, I guess when it comes to technology recording things, right? If you set it up before Shabbos or before the holiday, it's technically not a Jew who's doing the writing or the recording. So is this a prohibition for Jews? Would it be any different if if a non-Jew was to, do writing on the holidays?
Okay, so
if he was asked to do so prior to the holiday?
Excellent question, because there's two pieces to live streaming. There's the setting it into motion, and then there's being on the receiving end, right? There's the users. So Rabbi Heller spends many pages in his Teshuvah talking about the Shabbos Goy. I'm not so comfortable with that term. I'm not comfortable. I even
try to avoid that language.
Yeah, it's in Hebrew they say Goy shel Shabbat. That somehow makes it better. It's still bad. In any event, my policy, my general inclination about Shabbos Goy is not to ask non-Jews to do things that you yourself wouldn't do, unless it's a really extenuating circumstance, ongoing. When it comes to live streaming in general, in regular circumstances, that's not an extenuating circumstance. The other issue is the writing is certainly going to be going on at the side of the user. One other thing about the writing piece, the kotev, the violation of kotev, is that the computer itself is writing, even whether it's a Jew, non-Jew, whoever operates it, the computer is right now, as we're speaking, there is
constantly making records and recording events that are happening.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's whether or not I press the record button. If I just turn on my computer, something is registering. Somebody knows that I bought from Kohl's a pair of ski boots, 5 years ago, and is now going to, they know me, they've recorded that information, and I'm going to get a pop-up ad. So something's been recorded and there's a response to that. By the way, I don't ski. I have no idea why I came up with that example. And I don't even think Kohl's sells ski boots, but that's the example that came to mind. So there's that issue. The other piece with writing is the person being recorded. That's an issue. That's why I don't feel comfortable being in front of a camera. My brother, my nephew, I should say, my nephew's bar mitzvah many years ago, it was held somewhere. It was on Shabbat. It was a very long story, but my brother did not belong to a synagogue at that time, and they did kind of a make your own bar mitzvah. They didn't want to do it in a synagogue. I did offer joining Temple Beth Am, but he didn't do it at a synagogue. And it was very important to him and for Shalom Bayit and the family for me to go. And I said, I will absolutely go if I have to. I stayed at some hotel in Westfield and walked to whatever this place was. But then there was like the candle lighting. Okay, so clearly lighting candles is a violation of Shabbat. He wasn't asking me to light candles. He said, you don't have to light the candle, but could you just come up for Jake? I said, absolutely. And we came up. But the one caveat we had was, please don't take a picture of us. And the reason for that is because of the violation of Kotev. I was not the one taking the picture. They had a photographer, they had a videographer. But if you are observing Shabbat, you shouldn't be, you yourself should not be being recorded either. So it's not just a matter of who's operating, it's being on the receiving end of it as well. So thank you for
Thank you.
Do we have time for one more question before Minyan? No? Yeah. Any comments?
Phil Froelich asked a question in the chat.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, Rabbi.
Distinguish
Phil
between
Froelich has a
virtual
question in the chat.
teleconference and audio, like radio.
Between virtual teleconference. I'm trying to understand this from a tech perspective. Give me a second to process the information. I'm not so familiar with the technology over a radio station to know how to answer that from a halachic perspective. What I'm going to do is I'm going to write that question down so I can try to understand it better and try to answer it. Okay, give me a second. Although I know it's recording, I probably have some way of accessing this question, right? Or someone could just take out their iPhone and take a picture of it. Okay, so I'm sorry I can't answer that question now. I'm just not so familiar with the radio station. There is a distinction, though, between, someone did ask me this question. I don't know. Oh, yes, that's Carol Toth, I think, asked me this question. She wanted to know what the difference is between using a microphone and the live streaming. That was one of her questions. And there is a difference with that. There's no malacha that is being violated by the use of a microphone, as long as you don't set, that's something as long as it's set up before Shabbat. In certain Orthodox communities and conservative communities, there are people who do not use microphones because there is a concept called hashma'at kol, which is making a voice heard. It's not a malacha per se, but it is something like another category, kind of like a fence around the law to prevent you from violating. So very similar to, let me just think of another example. I can't, I completely just blanked, I don't know. But a microphone is something that it's like muktzah, okay? So muktzah, you're not supposed to touch something like money because you might then come to spend it. You're not supposed to touch a pen because you might write. Okay, so that's not a malacha. It's not you're not violating Shabbat by touching a pen, but it is a safeguard to prevent you from violating a malacha. So many people will not use a microphone for that reason because you might be tempted to adjust it. You might notice sometimes that when I'm at shul and the microphone is doing something funky and like I will use my elbow or like some other part of my body, like kila achar yad, I'll do like a different way of adjusting it because I'm not really supposed to be touching it. No, it's not a malacha, but it's a safeguard for a malacha. So when it comes to microphones, microphone is a very different thing than visual streams. And maybe that would address Phil's question perhaps in some way, because it is an audio-visual distinction between audio and visual. Creating visual meaningful symbols through writing or being recorded in some way or digitizing information, all of that all that stuff that takes place with a computer, that is more about writing than it is, it's more about the writing than it is about the audio. Yeah, the visual more than the audio. Okay, I think we have to dive in right now, which is a good thing to do. You're welcome to stay on for Minyan, not stay on for Minyan. You're welcome to take a break, come back. If you do have questions, if you want to send questions to me privately, because it's a hate. In the meantime, I am going to put a link up to Mincha. I don't know, Nathan, are you still here? Do you want to say any last words like you did at the previous?
I was just waiting for you to finish. I just wanted to thank the rabbi for setting up the classes today, both 1 o'clock and now. They were both well attended. There were questions, a lot of questions that were asked at the earlier class. And I hope that we were able to answer everybody's questions at this class. If you need more information or you weren't able to get to the class at all and you just came in right now for Minyan, if you want to stay online and we can answer a couple questions after Minyan. But again, thank you to the rabbi for setting all this up and trying to give us a little bit of a lesson in the Teshuvah.
Thanks, Nathan. I do have a question for you, Nathan, actually, before we start Mincha. Somebody texted me. I guess they didn't know how to use the chat, so they texted me on my phone. Wanted to know when will be a good forum for me or you or the two of us together to present the four-prong plan for the high holidays. That I just gave a sneak preview to that today and also at the earlier class, but will there be a forum where I can show the whole document, share the whole document?
Well, I think that the document isn't complete, number one. But number two, I'm going to have another session with the Cocktails and Conversations on Sunday after the drawing at 2 p.m. And we'll talk a little bit more about it there. But in reality, I believe that we'll have a letter that'll get sent out sometime next week that I hope to have more explanation. So we have another session on Monday with our scenario committee. And I'm hoping after that, I will have a letter that will go out to the community.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I was going to suggest, because some people don't tune into the Zoom, but a letter everyone gets.
Presumably. If you leave your house long enough to go to the mailbox, right? Okay, let me find a Siddur to put up on here. We're going to start with Mincha. Murray, do you want to lead us in Mincha?
My pleasure. Just give me a minute to put on a towel.
Okay. And give me a moment to post the link on here. And do we have Rick Robinson here? Did he leave?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Because I have to make sure that I announce page numbers in, if you didn't hear, Rick Robinson got as a gift for Father's Day from his beautiful daughters.
I have my pages on.
Ah, you do. Okay. He's got a Siddur Lev Shalem, which is a Shabbat Siddur. But there are some weekday prayers in there. They're just kind of hidden. They don't make them so easy to find because most people are not using this for weekday. But some of you are. I see Trisha has one, Phyllis has one, other people have it. So in the Shabbat Siddur Lev Shalem, Mincha is on page 289. And Siddur Sim Shalom for weekdays. Page 120. Yes, Murray, all yours.
Is a